Okay, there we go. I accidentally paused it. Okay. So, for tonight, as we were talking about, the message is about solitude and meditation. And at the outset, there are a few kind of distinctions to make, and the first one's about solitude. See, we oftentimes tend to conflate solitude with isolation. And the thing about it is that especially in the context of what we're talking about, when we reference solitude, what we're referring to is the concept of separating yourself out from people, from situations, from places, in order to have time to gather your thoughts, to think, to process. See, the big difference between the two comes down to the intent. A lot of people, they will seek solitude in their words, but their activities will be to isolate themselves. With isolation, what that entails is getting away from people to get away from people, to get away from situations, to get away from things, to pull themselves away, oftentimes to lick their wounds or to simply avoid the problems that there are. People oftentimes isolate as a means of self-preservation or out of spite, or there's a great number of different reasons for why people isolate. But with solitude, the intent is more often, in this case, and what we're discussing specifically, to figure out what to do, or to grow, to learn. And you can't, and that's the thing about solitude that's interesting, is that a lot of people will talk about, introverts, extroverts, the difference between the two. Introverts tend to draw their energy from, or recharge their energy from being separated from people, getting that time to themselves, where extroverts get recharged by people and being in community. But the reality of it is that solitude is a fundamental need for every single person. No matter how extroverted you are, you will have points where you will need to step away from people in order to breathe. Because things will overwhelm you. Things will get to be too much. You can't always have everything, you can't always do everything correctly on the fly. You will have plenty of times where you're going to need to take a step back. And you're going to need to think about what's happening, to process what's happening. And at no point is this need more more valid than when it comes to being a part of community, being a part of the kingdom of God, and also just being in a relationship with God. There are a great many stories of different disciples and different people. Even Jesus himself many times would go off on his own. He would seek solitude. He would separate himself from the rest of the group to have time where he could be with God, time where he could be alone, to process, to recover, to renew himself, as it were, and be able to then step back into the community that he was building. And it's an interesting thing. We spent a lot of time, Heather's been reading a lot of Henry Nouwen, specifically him talking about community and solitude and the different aspects of that. And he makes a very good point about solitude being a fundamental necessity for community. It is, oftentimes people conflate it with isolation, and they think it's an anti-community thing. You're going out by yourself, you're separating yourself from the community. But the truth of the matter is that that's not the intent. Sometimes things in the community get difficult, Sometimes you have to separate yourself from a situation in order to gain perspective. And sometimes it's just too noisy. Like, you want to ask God about something, but everyone's just in your ears, in your mind, in your head. And it's hard to, you get that little kind of ringing thing that happens, and you have to walk away. So you can get a break from that in order to then address whatever's going on. And this ends up being invaluable, because when you don't do that, when you have lots of people in a group, because one of the grand kind of failures is that since we oftentimes are inclined to view solitude in the same kind of negative light as isolation, or there are other things too, like anytime where you have a person separate from the herd, as it were, there are a lot of different labels that can be placed on that situation. Even loneliness, as was referenced. There are plenty of people that are lonely, but they're out there because they feel isolated. They feel separated from everybody else, like they don't belong. And that can oftentimes be deep-seated rejection issues, abandonment issues, things like that have swelled up and moved them away from being part of the community, or they might not have a community at all. There are a lot of little aspects of that, but when we talk about solitude here, we're talking about specifically the concept of how we move and process and are able to develop in community. And as stated, that's also in community with God, because there are plenty of times where you're going to have to move away from everyone else to get that time with Him, to be able to gain perspective, to gain levity. Maybe you've had a lot of people telling you different things and it didn't quite hit you right. So you need a moment away to kind of process and hear and pray. A lot of, I reference Jesus, but there are a lot of stories of prophets and apostles and so on going out into the desert. And oftentimes we kind of have this we have a sort of negative approach to the whole concept of a desert season. It ends up being a period of testing, and oftentimes it is like something that involves solitude. In the scriptures anyways. For us it's less so. Like we might find ourselves alone more often than not, but we don't always seek solitude with it. Oftentimes we'll just find ourselves separate from everybody because of circumstances. I know for my own personal desert seasons that I've been through, they've been periods of time where I wasn't able to have a lot of friends or family involved in my life. And I found myself alone with God in a lot of ways, having my own views and values kind of tested and pushed. As is exemplified when Jesus goes out into the desert. And after, 40 days and 40 nights of fasting, he's having Satan show up to tempt him with different things. Now that was kind of a special case, but the point is the same. It's just that it's a period where our stuff gets tested, and oftentimes it's a period where solitude's going to be important, because it's an opportunity for us to grow with God. Even Paul talks about how when he first gave his life to Jesus, after he had the scales removed from his eyes and he became, his experience with Jesus with Jesus on the street, or on the road. I can't remember the name of the road that he was on. Emmaus?
Damascus?
Oh, Damascus.
Damascus.
That's
Right. Yeah, he was on his way to Damascus. But that's the thing, is that he talks, I believe it's in Galatians, about how right after that he went straight to the deserts of Arabia and proceeded to venture around there, growing in his relationship with God and also preaching the gospel, wherever he was led to go. And then he came back to Jerusalem. He was one of those people who received that sort of call to go out into and to venture into that period of just being with God. So for us as individuals who were developing in relationship with God, there are plenty of times where, what's the best way for us to learn who God is and to experience God and to learn from him? Well, it's not always in a group of people where you're getting a lot of different interpretations of things or a lot of different views of things. If you have a relationship with God, then there's plenty of time where you're going to have to pull yourself away from the group in order to hear from him and get a clear picture of what he's saying or what he's wanting. Maybe the whole group's right. Maybe there are things that they're saying and they're hard for you to take because maybe it's butting up against old issues of abandonment, rejection, or it's hitting on triggers of feeling attacked. Or if you're somebody who doesn't handle criticism well, you're suddenly getting a lot of criticism from the group because of something that you did or said, or maybe it's something that they perceive that you said or did, and it's suddenly very hard for you to take. Well, you can either reject the group and leave, or you can take a moment, step aside, and just take it to God and get time with him. Seek solitude. And in that, process what's being said. Think about it. Weigh it. Feel it out. The thing about it is that in solitude, there's an opportunity to reflect on the various things that we're going through and the various things that are happening. And it runs deeper than simply, okay, I've got this scripture that I'm thinking about. It can run deep into the places of our hearts and souls, our minds, and how we think, how we act, why we believe what we believe. The reality is that we talk in this group a lot about the effect of culture and society and kind of systemic values that force us to think certain ways. Like we've talked about transactional relationships, for example, just recently. And the way that a lot of us as Americans growing up in America, we view relationship even on a very transactional thing. And these are not things that we just drop. And what's more is sometimes in community, there are things that the community might carry, because you never have a perfect community. There's always going to be that thing where the group has issues, and there's going to be a need for those to be addressed. But it also can't always be like, you're the one person coming in. Sometimes you're gonna have to step back and gain some perspective of even how to address that. And sometimes it's going to be things that are where you're needing to change because they get it and you don't. They've moved past the transactional relationship concept, and that's a struggle for you because you're like running around wanting to serve everybody. And they're not looking for that. They're looking for how they can serve you, and suddenly there's this clash. And you don't feel welcome or needed because you conflate the two. On some incidental level, you only feel that you're valuable to a group if they need you. You're never valuable to a group just because you're valuable. These are the kinds of things that can come up. This is just an example of a kind of like thing that one would need to process in solitude. Because we have to be able to reflect on ourselves and just let those feelings kind of come out. It was an interesting thing leading up to this, because one of the messages that we watched involved a video from a comedian where he was on I think he was on Conan, And he was talking about about the reality of just how much people these days, we just spend so much time in distraction. And as a result, we don't feel things. We don't reflect. A lot of us don't even have the ability to like sit down and just be in silence. We struggle with that. And I think it's funny because like I know for myself, I'm one of those people who always has that kind of like type A kind of gear that's just like, well, I can do that. I know that I can force myself to sit down in a silent room and have no distractions and be okay. I'd be fine. But see, the thing about it is that you have to prove that sometimes. And I thought it was an interesting little thing because I decided to test that out. You know, can I be without distraction? And this was something that I had kind of wondered about, because I had noticed my own personal inclination to like have something on in the background all the time, just for background noise, or you know, I was like multitasking or whatever. I put this video on from YouTube on so that I can hear what they're saying and learn from it while I'm doing dishes or whatever. But I had started to notice that I was like kind of subconsciously doing that with other things too. Things that maybe needed more of my focus. So I started to kind of worry. So I decided, after hearing that, I decided to test it out. And I'm just like, okay, well, let's see if I can actually do it. So I'm driving the car, I shut off the radio. And sure enough, there was this subconscious urge that I kept having to fight with to turn the radio back on, or to distract myself with one thing or another thing while I'm driving, which is bad. But that's the thing, is like sometimes we come to those crossroads, and sometimes there is like a level of discipline that we have to then exercise over our subconscious inclinations. And that's the thing about it, is that solitude often comes with an intentionality. The choice to take a break, take a breath, take a breather, and just kind of process, think through things, that kind of, whatever it is that's driving that. That's oftentimes a decision that's made on the person's behalf. So if I decide to separate myself from the community, if I decide to I'm going to go take a walk for a couple of hours, or I'm going to go for a hiking trip, just so I can be on my own for a little bit to kind of process things and think about things, that's a decision that I make. And we have to also get good at creating space for ourselves to make that decision. Not just mentally, where we stop saying, I can do that if I want, and actually do it, but also finding time and creating it because it matters. It's the same kind of thing as rest. You know, we talked about rest a couple years ago. We did a series on it. The kind of forgotten, super valuable thing that none of us do. You know, we get our days off of work and then we spend them running errands. It's not restful. We just more chaos. But the whole point is just that we have to be able to create time for ourselves to rest. And oftentimes, solitude can develop a place of rest for us, where we're allowed to process, where we're allowed to think. Which leads me into the point about meditation. And we'll circle back to solitude in a bit, but you know, just to talk for a minute about meditation and the value of that. You know, oftentimes if we, while there's plenty of stuff that we could process or grow through, there's also plenty of opportunity to meditate as we find solitude, or as we find time where we have free headspace. And you know, the whole concept of meditation when it comes to Christianity is different from us and others in that our focus is not on clearing our minds and seeing what comes up, but rather we focus in on something. It's to fill your mind, to fill your mouth, to be able to just spend time absorbing what you've been given. If somebody, for example, if you go to a church and you hear this a message about, living life in the kingdom of God, let's say something that's like kind of revolutionary to the way that you think about things. And, they've got everything that you need to back up what they're saying and explain, like, okay, this is legit. Maybe your concept of forgiveness is off. And they present an argument and a point about it. And the verses that they read are things that you have to sit there and absorb, and you read them and you think about them and you process them. And it becomes this thing, it's almost like a lot of people that I've heard, they reference the I believe it was the Torah, the Tanakh, where they use the same word for meditation as rumination. And it was just like, I don't know how true that is, but a lot of people I've heard over the years will argue, well, it preaches well. But the idea that a lot of them explained was that of spending time just chewing on this and absorbing every bit of nutrients, every bit of thought, every bit of revelation that you need in order to that you can pull and leach away from this lesson, this message, this verse, and be able to kind of absorb it into your being so it becomes a part of you. For us, meditation involves just taking the time and having the space to be able to absorb what God is saying to us, what God is bringing to light for us. And sometimes, that is also like personal stuff. Like just to give a personal example from this week. In that time of when I did create space to just kind of have solitude there, turned everything off and just let things be quiet. I did have a brief conversation with God where I asked him about, he asked me what I wanted to talk about, and I was like, well, nothing really at the moment. And I was like, I'm pretty sure I could come up with a million questions if I really wanted to think about it, but right now I'm okay just in the quiet. And he ended up posing this, and long story short, I did end up asking him, I'm like, okay, what would you want to talk about, if anything in the world, if there was nothing stopping you? And he made the point, he was like, I would like to tell you how much I value you and how much you mean to me, and have you be able to receive it. But you're not ready for that. So that is something that I've been meditating on every time when I've had free time where I'm not thinking about something or not doing something. I just kind of find myself going back to that and thinking about it and thinking about it and thinking about it. What does that mean? How does one find themselves in a place where they're able to receive something like that? What is it that stops me, for example, from being able to receive what God's trying to say? What are the things that are in the way? And this is something that comes through meditation. You start to, not only do you absorb what's there, but you also find yourself kind of having to process it what are the things in the way? What are the things stopping this from being a part of my life? What is it that makes me not believe this or argue with this? I mean, when Jesus says he's the truth, the way, and the life, but I would like to believe that there are lots of ways to heaven, how do I, why do I want it my way and why do I argue with this when Jesus is in fact saying this and I take that as truth? Just to give an example. It's in that process of meditation where we're able to kind of fight through the different things and really draw from God and have those changes occur, where we're able to be clear, we're able to have time and space, and we're able to create that. But we're also able to have it really sink in to who we are as people, and to let us be able to move forward and grow. And in the end, this ends up being one of the most important things for us, is to be able to grow. Because none of us have it all down. I have known fellow Christians who definitely think they have it all down. I mean, there's one guy in particular that comes to mind who's a friend of a friend, and every time I see him on Facebook, he knows his Bible really, really well, and he knows that, but he's also incredibly arrogant and elitist about it, and treats everyone else with absolute dismissal, and is not shy about talking about it in front of them. So he'll just make them feel like garbage, talk down to them, treat them like trash, just kind of illustrate in every way, shape, and form his pride, which I hear that's a pretty big sin. Just a little bit. And I know for myself, when I was younger, in my early 20s, I was very good at following the law, as it were. So there were times where, I had to accept the reality that I had not actually sinned that day in any way that I knew that I could sin. So asking for forgiveness wasn't necessary. And then, of course, ironically, from that point, I would start to get really proud of myself and become very prideful. And then I'd have to catch that and be like, how do I break that? And of course, in the process of meditating on that and, having that time with God, the answer ended up being, well, you get past that when it's not about you anymore. When it stops being that you have overcome. And it starts being that God has overcome, because you doing it on your own, you could force your behavior to change, but your heart will still be evil. There will still be corruption in there. So you need God to change your heart. And when he changes your heart, you stop having to fight with that thing anymore. So it stops being I overcame this because I acted differently, or I made this choice. And instead it becomes, I don't feel that anymore. I don't have the pull to be that way or to do that anymore. It's different. It's like it's just gone. And that's something that's where we circle back to solitude again. Because one of the things with this is that it's one thing to talk about, we've established why these two things are important. We've established now what they do, what's the purpose, what they are. But the big thing, that we struggle with is not why we need to do them or what's important or what's valuable about them. It's doing them. And the thing about it is that a lot of us really struggle with solitude and meditation for a lot of different reasons, but some of the biggest end up coming down to our struggles with it. And what I mean by that is, let's say that you take time, you decide, okay, well, you know what, I am going to take time. I'm going to spend some time just in the quiet, by myself, just thinking about these things that God has given me to think about, or these lessons that stuck out to me, or, whatever. And I'm going to kind of just give it time. Well, then what happens? You start thinking about a lot of different things. Suddenly all these other things come to mind, and you start thinking about those. And then, some of them are distracting, and then you say, oh no, I gotta stop that. I'm supposed to be focused on this. And then it becomes a whole other thing. So let's say you've put aside 4 or 5 hours. So you then spend 4 or 5 hours struggling with your own mind, trying to put yourself back into control of a situation and in the end of that 4 or 5 hours, you feel like you have nothing to show for it. You've just spent the whole time fighting with yourself, and you didn't arrive at anything. You didn't obtain some greater clarity. You just kind of had a bunch of jumbled thoughts for a few hours, and now you're frustrated about it. And one of the most important things to say with that is that's okay. It was an interesting thing, because it was actually one of the Henry Nouwen messages that Heather read some time ago, where he made a very good point about when thoughts like that come in your times of meditation or solitude, letting those thoughts come and then letting them pass. Not trying to fight them out, not trying to overtake them, but letting them come and then letting them have their time. See, the thing about it is that, to go back to that comedian, one of the most interesting little points that he made was he talked about how we spend so much time in distraction that we don't allow ourselves to feel anything. And he explained a story about himself where he was driving down the road and this one song came on, and it triggered all these emotions. He started to feel really sad because of the song and the memories associated with it. And he mentioned how most people, they'll just turn the station and put something else on so they don't have to feel that. But in this instance, what he decided to do was to stop the car and just listen to the song and let whatever happened. And he wound up bawling his eyes out. Yeah, he's okay. He has that happen occasionally. Our poor little guy. The vet didn't find anything wrong with him. She just said it was like a normal issue with their breathing. But anyway, he makes this point about how he stopped, he let himself feel everything, and then he just wept for a period of time, and then he was okay after. And that was kind of the thing. He went back to that point of how, because we're so distracted, we're not feeling things, we're not letting things pass. We have all these jumbled thoughts and things going on inside of us that we're not even able to address. And sometimes you have to take the time, just let yourself be in the quiet with those things, to let them have their time and to process through them. And this was a big thing when Henry Nouwen was talking about it in one of his discussions about meditation and solitude, that was another part of it, was just letting those things pass. Because the thing of it is that since we're so detached, we have things going on, we have thoughts, we have issues, we have all kinds of distracting things. Sometimes we have problems inside of us that we need to resolve. And there's nothing wrong with that happening. You know, God's not surprised and he's not mad at you because you didn't focus on the thing that he gave you. You know, it's not like it's a surprise to him that you had all this stuff going on inside your heart. He knows your heart. As it so happens, God is acutely aware of everything inside of your heart that you're not aware of. He gets it. He sees it. He's aware. Whereas for us, we're too busy, you know, watching TV, as we were talking about earlier, being distracted by that. Or, you know, pulling our attention every which way that we can in order to not have those moments where we actually have to feel what's going on. And the thing about it is sometimes that's actually really crippling for us, because what we end up doing is we forget how to process some of these emotions. So things like sadness, despair, anger, they can become so overwhelming that we can't even take the time. The idea of taking time and actually processing through those emotions is more terrifying than the idea of never having them addressed and having to live with them till the day that you die, or more terrifying than the idea of actually not ever knowing God, because it's so uncomfortable. So we don't take time, we don't face these things down, and as a result they just linger there. Another occasion that is worth talking about is when we fall asleep. Like, one thing that happens in solitude, in times of trying to be on your own and meditating and so on, is that you might just pass out. I've known so many people, I've been one of those people. I remember when I was younger, in my early 20s, I would try to spend time praying, and I'd fall asleep while I was praying and wake up and feel like I disrespected God. And I'd apologize profusely, ask for forgiveness for my great sin of falling asleep while praying. Thankfully, that didn't have as much time as it could have. You know, God mercifully sent somebody who was like, why would you apologize for that? You fell asleep in the presence of God. What better thing could you do? And I was like, well, that's a good point. Thank you for that. But, you know, we get on these kinds of like mindsets, especially when we have like an inclination towards things like people pleasing. You know, we think that we're failing. We think that we're not doing good enough. And then what's worst is you might like be inclined to argue that you're right to feel this way because at the Garden of Gethsemane, when Jesus came out and found the disciples sleeping around the garden, he was like, could you not keep watch for just a moment? And they were ashamed. And we use verses like that as weapons to, you know, prod ourselves and stab ourselves repeatedly. When in reality, Jesus is greater. Even though Jesus asked the disciples specifically, can you keep watch? Unless he specifically asked you to stay up and pray, last known information probably falls back to more of like a Matthew 11, where he says, come to me, all you who are weak and weary, and I will give you rest. Unless Jesus has specifically asked something of you, don't presume that you are supposed to be held to the same account as somebody who had a specific request. Presume instead that you're one of the people where he said something more general. like, come to me, love your neighbor. It keeps us safe from the inclination to levy such harsh judgments on ourselves. Because Jesus, this might be like a revolutionary statement, but God does not expect you to be anything other than a human at any point in time. Even the passage that I spent like 20 minutes trying to dig up because I can't ever seem to separate Elisha and Elijah, the story of that one, which is out of is it 1 Kings 19? Yep, 1 Kings 19. Where right after going and like having that moment on the mountain where Elijah had went up there by himself and then had the priests of Baal come out. You know that story. Go, cut yourselves more, that way maybe Baal will pay attention to you. So the priests of Baal danced harder and cut themselves more, and nothing happened. And then God, when Elijah finally turned and asked, God moved. Well, the thing about it is that a lot of people missed the next story, which was right after that happened. Jezebel was thoroughly upset, shall we say, and wanted Elijah's head. Elijah, having just come off of this experience where God made himself very well known, panicked and ran off into the wilderness at the thought of Jezebel wanting him dead. But you know what's funny about that? Is that when he went out there, he ran off and hid in a cave out in the desert. And what happened was the angels attended to him. God sent an angel to feed him and give him water, and he slept. And then he slept. And then God had the angel wake him up, feed him and give him water, and then he slept more. And the statement was, just to read it, get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you. The thing about it is that we take a lot of really heavy and hard journeys upon ourselves long before we're ready. I just noticed, I just saw a random blurb of a guy, a pastor, who tried to beat Jesus' record for fasting, and he died in the desert after 30 days. He couldn't beat 40, it turns out. But the thing about it is that one of the things that I believe and would argue to my grave that we oftentimes forget to pay attention to is that God has no delusions about our abilities to survive in this world. He designed us needing to eat and rest. So we take it upon ourselves to push all the time. We're gonna push through needing to sleep. We're gonna push through needing feed. We're gonna push through needing to heal. You know, I've got 2 broken arms and a fractured rib, but you know what? I can go. I can keep fighting the good fight. And as a result, we just hurt ourselves more and more and more. And none of it's stuff that God's calling us into. God's saying go rest, and we're like, but I can still go. And you know, he's not always willing to bench us. So we just persist and fight through. I've had times where God has called me to take a year off or something like that because, you know, I got banged up. I remember having one group, it was just one group after another group that fell apart or turned on me. And in the aftermath of it, God was very clear that you need to stop. You need to take a year off and you need to rest. So that's what I had to do. And it was frustrating at times because I felt like I needed to get back in the game, as it were. You know, you get that weird kind of thing that says, oh, I need to go do things in order to prove that I am the most Christian of Christians. Or you get into those mindsets of saying that, you know, you need to be proving your faith. And the thing about it is that God has no delusions about your faith. God has no delusions about who you are. God has no delusions about your nature. He has no delusions about the things inside your heart. He has no delusions about anything about you. That's all us. Every bit of that is us. That's just us and our id projecting that onto God and projecting that onto our faith and persisting and pushing through in such a way so as to completely destroy ourselves in the name of God in ways that He is not calling us to do. And see, the thing about it is without taking those times, if you go and you are pushing yourself all the time and then you go to spend that time, you say, oh, I'm going to get some solitude in, I'm going to sit down, I'm going to spend some time with God, and you fall asleep, sleep. Rest. Just rest. Because that's what you need. And don't feel bad about it when you wake up. Don't assume your failure because your body needed rest when you had been driving yourself so hard for so long. If you need food, eat. You know, unless you are trying to fast or something like that, that's all fine. But if you're just hungry, just eat something. It's better that you eat something than spend 30 minutes fighting with the deep hunger pains as you try to force yourself to focus on God. Just eat something and then progress from there. If you have a lot of stuff going on inside of you, remember that the Psalms were worship. The Psalms include David either expressing his delight in the Lord or his feelings of utter and complete rejection from the Lord. Both. And both were songs that were sang in the temple. Because what mattered was the expression. And sometimes you're going to have yourself trying to meditate on what God gave you, and instead you're going to spend time expressing how angry you are at, you know, this friend of yours, or this pastor, or this teaching that you heard, or so many different things. Or maybe God Himself, when you finally get down to the reality of it, and you have to confess that maybe there are things about God that you don't like. That's a fair thing that happens. You know, just be aware that God's not afraid of confrontation, as Job once learned through a hurricane or a tornado, I believe it was, that showed up speaking to him. And that's not meant to say, you know, be afraid. It's meant to say He will talk. He will address the things that you don't like about Him. He will address the things that you have going on to clarify who He is and why it matters and why He feels the way He does. God can talk for Himself just fine. And the fun thing about it is in those moments of, like, in those times when we're just with Him, whether meditating in solitude, you know, whatever verbiage you want to attach to it, but when we're in those moments with Him and we get to hear from Him, that's when we're developing that relationship. Like, that's just a part of it. It's a stepping stone, and He's aware of that. Oftentimes we're not. we might walk away feeling like the worst people in the world because we got mad at God, and now we're going to be punished and go to hell. And he's just like, yeah, that was good that we talked. You know, we very much need to detach ourselves and our perspective of how things are from God to let him have his own. And the best way to develop that is in this time. You don't have to do it all perfect. It's okay. Like, the truth of the matter is, it's going to be messy because humans are messy creatures. I mean, there's a reason why the camera here is angled in such a way so that nobody can see the table. It's just a mess of cords, cards, and pens, and I have these small wild boar miniatures set aside to paint at some point. There's no like, God does not maintain the weird kind of ideas about us that we do. Like, we look at it and we say, well, we're supposed to be like good soldiers for Jesus, and you know, we're supposed to be following the law perfectly, and you know, we're supposed to be exemplifying Jesus in every way, and we're supposed to be the light, salt and the light. And although all of that is factual, there's also a process of getting there. You don't just go from little baby in Jesus to demon fighting soldier. That's not a 3-day thing. You know, we start off as children when we're reborn. And there's a process of growth. And we don't like that. We like to just jump from point A to point Z, because the rest of it's a waste of time, and God's just like, that's not a choice. You can run around and proclaim that you're like the most powerful prophet in the world, but that's not going to mean anything when when you're incidentally quoting a cup that you read one time, as opposed to the Bible, and claiming it's from the Bible, and somebody mentions that you're wrong. All of this stuff is meant to develop us in relationship. And it's not just, whether it's for community, whether it's with God, all of this is meant for us as a whole. Community does not get maintained. See, the thing about it is that when we are constantly in the midst of it and in the thick of it, oftentimes our perceptions can get skewed. A good way to think about it, I suppose, is imagine yourself as a mouse on the ground. The world around you is grass. How much of the world do you see from that perspective? You just see what's right in front of you. Whereas if you're an eagle and you're flying above, you can see all the different paths laid out before that mouse, and where they go, and how they move about. And also that you can see the snake that's waiting at the end of the one to the left to consume that mouse. Sometimes seeking solitude involves becoming that eagle for a moment. We need to be able to take a step back, to take a step above the ground level, and kind of see things for what's really going on. Because we need to gain perspective. And that's important for community, because if everyone's out there in the weeds, there's stuff going on that not everybody's seeing. I've had more than enough occasions where I've ventured into communities where, a friend invited me or something like that. And being an outsider and having an outside perspective, I saw so many different things that were just off and wrong and weird. And when asking my friends about it, they didn't always see it. And they would see it after and be like, wow, that's really odd. I never noticed that before. It's like, well, how could you not? You've been here. You've been living in here. But that's the point. It's important for the development, the growth, and the progression of any community, and also for the unity of any community, to be able to have people, like, be able to separate for just a minute and think about things, process things, feel things. You know, maybe somebody in your community slighted you, and maybe you forgot about it, but you didn't. You've been teaching them, you've been acting very standoffish with that person the whole time, because even though you forgave and forgot, so to speak, you were still mad at them on some level. Nothing was addressed. And sometimes it's going to take that time away to, like, or that time separated to be allowed to kind of like see it. So in the end, we find ourselves with this state of needing these things in order to progress our communities, in order to progress our relations with God. And they're not always, some of it seems counterintuitive from what we're taught and how we're taught to view things, but I hope that we've kind of expressed, like, the value of this, even though it might seem counterintuitive to take a break from a community and then come back. But it does end up being important. It does end up being valuable. And what's more is it ends up being really important for us, just on an individual basis, for so many different ways, for so many different reasons. Everything from our own mental health, our own physical health, if that's what it comes down to, and you're one of those ones who's exhausted and needing that physical rest. But whatever the case, always understand that whatever happens when you take that time, and sometimes, you will find yourself taking a step back and realizing that a community is toxic and that you need to leave. That does happen, and that's okay too. Like, bear in mind, take time with it, think about it, feel it out, and determine whether it really is them or if it's you. But, if it really is them, then get out. Go find a new community, one that isn't going to be abusive or toxic or, gossipy or whatever. But in the end, there's such a value in being able to gain that deeper headspace. And the act of seeking solitude and having it, meditating on what the Holy Spirit has given you to work with. These things are so incredibly important for us to progress in our relationships with God and our relationships with people, just in our walks in life in general. And in the end, it's a very beautiful and valuable thing that we have afforded to us, that we have a God who completely understands our both our needs and our inclinations, and isn't going to be, surprised at our lack of ability to perform or whatever, because he understands us better than we do. So, and that's what I got.